Most people buy the wrong turntable first, and they don't find out for about 6 months. Then the cartridge can't be upgraded, the tone arm's plastic, and the whole thing becomes an expensive lesson. I'd rather you skip that part. So here are 5 decks worth owning, from $150 up to serious money, and I'll tell you exactly who each one is for. Starter deck, and this is where almost everyone should begin. The Audio-Technica AT-LP60X sits around $150 to $180 depending on the day, and it's the cheapest record player I'd put my name behind. Here's why that price point matters so much. Below it, you're into the territory of suitcase players and novelty decks with ceramic styli that press down on your grooves at 5 to 7 grams. A proper cartridge tracks at roughly 1.5 to 2. That difference isn't a spec sheet argument, it's the difference between playing a record and slowly sanding it. And before we go further, if this kind of straight, no-fluff breakdown is what you came for, tap subscribe so the next one finds you. Also, keep something in the back of your head while we work through these 5, because at the end, I'm going to tell you about the thing that shapes your sound more than any deck on this list, and it's not the turntable. It's worth understanding what those cheap novelty players are actually doing, because the damage isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. A stylus riding at 6 or 7 grams doesn't scratch a record in one pass, it flattens the fine detail in the groove walls a little at a time. Play a favorite album 50 times on one of those and the high frequencies quietly disappear, and no amount of cleaning brings them back. That's why the floor of this list sits where it does, not snobbery, physics. There's also a Bluetooth version of this same deck if you want to send music to wireless speakers, and it costs a bit more for that convenience. One more practical note, because it comes up constantly with gift buyers, this deck comes with everything you need in the box aside from speakers, so nobody ends up unwrapping it and discovering they can't use it. Alright, back to the LP60X. It's fully automatic, which means you press start and the arm lifts, moves over, drops onto the lead-in groove, and returns home when the side finishes. For a first deck, that's a bigger deal than people admit, because the #1 fear a beginner has is dropping a needle onto a record and wrecking it. This machine removes that fear completely. It's belt-driven, it does 33 and 45, and crucially, it has a built-in phono preamp with a switch on the back. That means you can run it straight into powered speakers or a computer and get sound immediately. No extra boxes, no extra money. Now the honest limits, because there are real ones. The cartridge isn't meaningfully upgradable. You're swapping the stylus rather than moving up to a better cartridge later. The build is light and plasticky compared to everything else on this list. And the sound, while clean and completely safe for your records, is the floor of decent rather than anything an audiophile would call refined. But here's what it gets right. It protects your collection, it costs less than 4 or 5 new records, and it lets you find out whether you actually love this hobby before you spend real money. A lot of people skip this rung entirely, drop $600 on a serious deck, and discover 8 months later, they play records twice a month. This is the low-risk way in. Buy this, live with it for a year, and if you find yourself buying records every week, you'll know exactly what to upgrade and why. That's a much smarter path than guessing at the start. And if you ever move up from it, this deck holds its value reasonably well secondhand, or it becomes the player you keep in a bedroom or an office, which softens the cost even further. And speaking of upgrading, the moment most people outgrow the LP60X is the moment they want control over the arm and the speed, which is exactly what the next deck hands you. Direct drive, and the Audio-Technica AT-LP120XUSB is the workhorse of this entire list. It runs somewhere between $350 and $400, and it's the deck I'd recommend to more people than any other if the LP60X feels too basic. Let's unpack what direct drive actually means, because the term gets thrown around without explanation. On a belt-driven deck, a motor sits off to the side and spins the platter through a rubber belt, which isolates motor vibration nicely. On a direct drive deck, the motor sits directly under the platter and turns it itself. The result is instant startup, rock-solid speed stability, and a mechanism that shrugs off heavy daily use. Neither approach is better in the abstract, they just suit different people, and this is the one built to be used hard. Now here's what makes this specific model such a good buy. It plays 33, 45, and 78 RPM, so if you inherit a box of old shellac records from a relative, this deck actually plays them, which most modern turntables can't. It has a built-in preamp with a switch, so like the LP60X, it runs straight into powered speakers with nothing extra. It has a USB output, letting you digitize your collection onto a computer using free software. And critically, it has a removable headshell and adjustable anti-skate, which means you can genuinely upgrade the cartridge down the road and dial the setup in properly. That upgrade path is the thing separating a deck you keep from a deck you replace. The shaped tone arm has a hydraulic lift, so you lower the needle with a lever rather than your hand, and the bass is damped to cut down on low-frequency feedback from your speakers. It's fully manual though, so nothing returns home on its own at the end of a side, which is worth knowing if you tend to fall asleep listening. Have you ever left a record spinning for an hour after it finished because you got distracted? On this deck, the needle sits in the run-out groove until you get up, and that's a habit worth breaking. The pitch control and quartz speed lock are inherited from this deck's DJ ancestry, and even if you never mix a record in your life, that lineage means the speed accuracy is held to a standard most home decks don't bother with. Let me set expectations on the USB feature too, because people buy this deck for it and then never use it. Digitizing a record isn't a button press. It's recording in real time. So a 40-minute album takes 40 minutes. Then you split the tracks and tag them yourself in free software. For a handful of rare records you can't stream, it's brilliant. For an entire collection, it's a project you should walk into with your eyes open. The removable headshell deserves one more line, because it's the quiet reason this deck ages well. Cartridges mount to that little detachable piece, so swapping to a better one later takes minutes rather than a careful realignment session. And you can even keep two headshells set up for different types of records. Weight matters here too. This thing is substantially heavier than the LP60X, and that mass is doing real work against vibration. Setup on this one is quick too. The cartridge comes pre-mounted and aligned, so you're balancing the counterweight and setting anti-skate, and that's about it. For someone who wants one deck that does everything, digitizing, old records, DJ-style pitch control, and a real upgrade path, this is the answer. It's also the last deck on this list that plugs into anything and just works, which is a detail that becomes very important in about 30 seconds. Sound jump. Because the Fluance RT85 is where the sound quality genuinely changes character. It sits around $550, and the reason it punches so far above that is sitting on the end of the tone arm. It ships with an Ortofon 2M Blue cartridge, which on its own retails for well over $200. So a meaningful chunk of what you're paying for is a cartridge most people buy as an expensive upgrade later. Since the cartridge shapes your sound more than almost any other single component, getting a great one pre-installed and pre-aligned is a serious head start. The rest of the deck is built to support it. There's an acrylic platter instead of an aluminum one, which damps resonance and adds rotational mass for steadier speed. There's a heavy MDF plinth and isolation feet designed to keep footsteps and speaker vibration from reaching the needle. There's a servo-controlled motor keeping speed accurate, and an auto-stop feature that shuts the platter off at the end of a side. In listening terms, what you notice first is detail up top. Cymbals and vocal texture come through with a clarity that cheaper decks simply don't reach, and bass notes have defined edges instead of a general thump. If you're wondering why one component can matter this much, here's the short version of what a cartridge does. The stylus rides in the groove and traces microscopic wiggles in the wall, and the cartridge converts that physical movement into an electrical signal. Everything downstream is just amplifying what that little assembly managed to read. A better one reads more accurately, so more of what's actually pressed into the record survives the trip to your ears. That's why upgrading a cartridge on a decent deck often does more than replacing the whole turntable. There's also a variant of this deck that ships with a different cartridge at a slightly different price, so when you're shopping, check which one you're actually looking at rather than assuming. And a placement tip that costs nothing: keep this deck off the same surface as your speakers and away from thin, wobbly shelving, because its sensitivity to vibration cuts both ways. Here's the catch, and it's the one that trips up first-time buyers constantly. This deck has no built-in preamp. Plug it into powered speakers and you'll get a thin, almost silent signal that sounds broken, because a turntable's output needs to be amplified and equalized before anything else can use it. So you need either an amplifier with a dedicated phono input or a separate phono preamp, which runs anywhere from about $100 up. Budget for that from the start, or the deck arrives and disappoints you through no fault of its own. Plan on somewhere between $100 and $180 for a solid phono stage, and treat that as part of the deck's price rather than an optional extra. A couple of other honest gaps: there's no USB, no Bluetooth, and no 78 RPM. It's also fully manual, and because it's fairly sensitive to vibration, putting it on the same shelf as your speakers can cause feedback. What you're buying here is focused, uncompromised sound for the money and nothing else. If your priority is hearing what your records actually contain, this is the sweet spot of the whole list. But if you're the type who plans to keep tinkering and upgrading for years, there's a deck that's built more deliberately for that, and the difference is in a single component: upgrade path. And that's the entire argument for the Pro-Ject Debut Carbon EVO at around $650. The headline feature is an 8.5-inch one-piece carbon fiber tonearm, and I want to explain why that matters rather than just listing it. The tonearm's job is to hold the cartridge dead steady while the groove pushes it around, so any flex, resonance, or twist becomes distortion you hear. Carbon fiber is stiff and light, an unusual combination, which lets the arm resist bending without adding weight the bearings have to fight. The practical consequence is that this deck rewards better cartridges more than cheaper decks do. Put a great cartridge on a mediocre arm and you're limited by the arm. Put one on this arm and you hear the cartridge. That's why this is the deck for someone who plans to keep improving their system rather than buying once and stopping. It arrives with the Sumiko Rainier cartridge, and here's the clever part: you can upgrade to better cartridges in that same family by swapping the stylus alone. No full replacement and no realignment. That's a rare piece of thoughtfulness at this price. It also has electronic speed selection for 33 and 45, so you're not lifting the platter and moving the belt by hand for standard speeds. And Pro-Ject redesigned the motor suspension over the previous generation, measurably cutting mechanical noise. Let me give you a sense of what the upgrade ladder actually looks like on this deck, since that's the whole pitch. You start with the stock cartridge, and when you're ready, you move up within the same family by swapping just the stylus assembly. Each step brings more detail and better tracking, and none of them require you to redo the alignment work. Further down the road, you can change the phono preamp, add better isolation under the plinth, or eventually move to an entirely different cartridge, and this arm will show you every one of those changes rather than blurring them together. One practical note: 78 RPM isn't available at the flick of a switch here the way 33 and 45 are, so old shellac isn't this deck's strength. And the manual assumes a bit of patience, so set aside a quiet evening for the first setup rather than rushing it before a party. Now the trade-offs, and this deck asks more of you than anything else here. It's fully manual with no auto stop, so the arm sits in the runout until you lift it. There's no built-in preamp, so like the Fluance, you'll need a phono stage. And the first setup is real work. You're balancing the counterweight, setting anti-skate, and leveling the plinth, and if you rush it, the deck will sound worse than a $150 automatic. That sounds intimidating the first time, and honestly, it is, a little. It's also a 40-minute job you do once, with a manual and about 100 videos to walk you through it. If you want to plug in and press play forever, this isn't your deck, and I'd point you back a section. If the idea of tuning your own system sounds like part of the fun, this is the one that keeps giving back for years. It's the difference between owning a turntable and owning a system that happens to start with one. And that distinction is what people are really buying at this price. Which leaves one question hanging over this whole list: what happens when you stop wanting to compromise at all? Premium pick. And for that, we're going to Technics, specifically the SL-40CBT-K. Technics is the name behind the legendary SL-1200, the deck that defined direct drive for decades, and that engineering lineage is exactly what you're buying into here. The centerpiece is a coreless direct drive motor, and the reason it's a big deal comes down to a problem called cogging. In an ordinary motor, the magnetic pull between rotor and stator creates tiny pulses of speed rather than perfectly smooth rotation, and at the scale a stylus works at, those pulses smear the sound. A coreless design removes the iron core causing them, and you get rotation that's simply steadier than the alternatives. On top of that, it pairs a precision tonearm with an audiophile-grade cartridge and an aluminum construction that fights resonance. And unusually for a deck at this level, it has Bluetooth built in, so you can send music to wireless speakers or headphones without wiring a system at all. That combination is rare. Most decks make you choose between serious analog engineering and modern convenience, and this one refuses to. A word on the Bluetooth, since it's the unusual part of this deck. Sending vinyl wirelessly does compress the signal, so a purist running a wired system will get more out of the analog chain than the wireless one. But that misses who this feature is for. It's for the person who wants a serious deck in a room where running speaker cable isn't happening, or who wants to listen through headphones at night without a stack of boxes. Having the option and ignoring it costs you nothing. Who should skip this one? Honestly, is anyone chasing maximum sound per dollar? Because at this level, you're partly paying for engineering pedigree and build quality rather than pure measurable performance over the Fluance or the Pro-Ject. So let me bring the whole list together, because you've now got 5 very different answers. If you're brand new and want zero risk, the LP60X at around $150 is the correct starting point, and it will not hurt your records. If you want one deck that handles everything, digitizing, old 78s, upgrades later, the LP120XUSB at roughly $350 to $400 is the workhorse. If sound quality is the whole point and you don't mind buying a phono preamp, the Fluance RT85 at about $550 gives you the biggest jump in what you actually hear. If you want a foundation you'll be improving for a decade, the Pro-Ject Debut Carbon EVO at around $650 is built for exactly that. And if you want Technics engineering with wireless convenience baked in, the SL-40CBT-K is the one to look at. Now, the thing I flagged at the start, the one that matters more than which of these 5 you choose. Your turntable is roughly a third of your sound. The phono preamp is another slice, and your speakers are the biggest slice of all. I've watched people agonize over $100 difference between decks and then run the whole thing into a pair of 10-year-old computer speakers. And that's the real mistake. If your budget is $600 total, you'll be happier with a $350 deck and $250 spent on decent speakers and a preamp than with a $600 deck feeding something weak. Spend across the chain, not on one link. 2 things I'd flag as still moving: prices on these decks swing hard, particularly around big sale periods. So check what it's actually selling for before you commit, rather than trusting any number in a video. And stock on the pricier models comes and goes, so if one's sitting available at a good price, that's often the moment. So which way are you leaning? First deck or upgrade, and what are you running them through? Tell me in the comments, because the speaker half of this question is where I can actually help. Records outlast every piece of gear you'll ever play them on. Buy the deck that treats them properly, and the rest of the system can grow around it for years. That's 5 turntables, from $150 to a deck with real Technics engineering inside. The LP60X for a safe start, the LP120XUSB for doing everything, the Fluance RT85 for pure sound per dollar, the Pro-Ject Debut Carbon EVO for a system you'll keep building, and the Technics SL-40CBT-K when you want the engineering and the wireless convenience together. Remember, the 2 decks in the middle of that list need a phono preamp, so factor that in before you order. Links to all 5 are in the description, and prices move, so check before you buy. Which one's going in your setup? Drop it below. If this saved you from a bad first purchase, hit like and subscribe to Premium Tech. Catch you in the next one. Peace.